feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie podcast. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck, alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin. My voice
It sounded
cracked
like
there.
you were hitting puberty for the first time, Matt.
How are you doing?
I'm okay. How about you? Other than hitting puberty.
It's a rainy day in Pizzaville. It's been we're having one of those gloomy
Novembers?
falls. Yeah, like which is fine. I mean, I like autumn. I love the leaves changing. I love I don't love a winter, but our winters are getting warmer. It was alarmingly warm last week. And then
Shorts
this week
weather warm.
yeah, I know. I wore shorts in November, which is wild. And it's a little crummy out today on this. We're actually recording this on Remembrance Day. Actually, I don't know if it's fitting for not really for this, but wars.
Well, for the movie, I would say
yeah,
it is.
I'd say it is pretty relevant. So, and I think it fits the mood of the haterade we've been drinking this year, or you specifically have been drinking this year.
Just can't get enough, baby.
We've been becoming more cynical and contrarian as the years go by, but we're having one of those years, Eric, where you more than me, I'd say, but I mean both of us, I'd say, with me with things like Anora and
the
stuff
wild
like that.
Robots.
Yeah, and you just hating basically everything.
Yeah,
let's be honest.
It's all about that haterade, baby. But it's always nice to know that you're autumnal. You enjoy the fall. You're talking about it being a gloomy November. It just makes me think about the song "Sweet November Rain" by Guns N' Roses. It all comes together. We're doing this, as you mentioned, on Remembrance Day in Canada, Veterans Day in the U.S. So it's perfect, timing to talk about Steve McQueen's Blitz, which was one of our most anticipated films of 2024. Steve McQueen, in I think both of our opinions, is one of the best filmmakers working today. Everything he has done up until now has been, in my opinion at least, a masterpiece, or at the very least
excellent.
some of the best filmmaking out there, and that includes Widows, in terms of how he took his assured style of filmmaking and something that was a little bit more avant-garde and off-center and brought that into a commercial play. Blitz is a film that takes that same assured filmmaker that's assertive, that is astute in all of his choices, and the whole time you're watching this thing, it feels as though he's self-conscious of what he's doing, trying to find some sort of balance between sentimental and serious. But what you get is almost corny, and there's something almost humorous about it in an unintentional way, where you're laughing at the character's predicament, given how this little mixed race boy George in London in 1940, during the London Blitz, when you had the Germans come in and bombard London, you had families sending away their children to the countryside in order to protect them. And so every time we see George, who decides that he wants to reunite with his mother, who's played by Saoirse Ronan. George is played by newcomer Elliott Heffernan. We see this character journey back to the city and meet up with people. And every time he meets up with somebody, I don't know really if this is a spoiler, because this is just what war is, they die, or someone near them dies. And it almost feels like it's a David Zucker-esque sort of parody of war movies and coming of age films, almost, in that it shouldn't be, but you're laughing at how awful the predicament it is. And every time the character has to like jump off of something, or try to make his way through something, and it just becomes almost unbearable to watch. And it's also sluggishly paced. But Matt, I know I've just kind of blared on about it, but I felt so like watching this from someone that you really admire, and like even writing my review for Rogers, I kind of struggled with finding the positive in something
Yeah.
that is almost a little too saccharine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's a huge bummer, I'd say, because I'm with you in absolutely loving everything McQueen's done up to this point. And yeah, I think it's just a movie that's kind of confused and doesn't really know what it wants to be. And, I think certain films can kind of toe that line with, serious and sweet. But this movie has such kind of jarring kind of whiplash when it comes to that throughout the entire thing, that to your point, what you just said, it becomes comical. And that's definitely not the intention of the film, because there are some really kind of horrific things happening. And this was a real horrific thing that happened. But when you play with what seemingly feels like, it's not historical fiction, but it does feel like it's a jumble of a bunch of different stories that people have told over the years of maybe things that happened during the Blitz. And what it feels like is McQueen's put all of those different stories that happened probably to multiple different children or multiple different people and kind of compiled it into this one young boy. So as the film plays out, you have these kind of whiplash kind of moments. And the further it goes on, when all of this takes place within basically 24 hours, it becomes ridiculous to the point where, again, you're like, oh my God, another thing is happening to this boy, or he's basically sold into, a Cockney kind of like criminal organization to steal things. He's, a flood happens, this bomb, like he just, all these ridiculous things happen. And they're not ridiculous because they probably did happen. But when you throw them onto one child in 24 hours, it just becomes this kind of like, holy fuck, maybe didn't need to throw everything into this. Maybe we could have just chosen a lane and kind of honed in on that and kind of made this kind of, which a movie that probably could have been super impactful, super touching by the end. You just kind of go, it becomes almost like these little skits almost, that, to your point, whether they feel like satire, they feel like parody at times, which is just a huge bummer. From a technical standpoint, obviously Steve McQueen's an amazing filmmaker, and I think you see that in the movie. I think it looks good. The score is weird. Hans Zimmer's score is weird. At times it feels like a horror film, and then times it feels like, a John Williams kind of thing or whatever. And I think it's trying to toe that line of that Amblin kind of focusing on the kid, but being serious at times. And very few filmmakers, I think, can make that work. And unfortunately, like McQueen and this just never worked. Like the sweet moments are undercut by some of the really kind of like, and I like whiplash kind of like tonal shifts usually, but like in this, it just felt completely out of place. When you would jump back and forth, you're like, ooh, that really like disturbing, R-rated kind of like dark shit feels off with kind of the sweet sentimental stuff that you were talking about. So, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I found myself kind of like, oh fuck, man. Like this guy is so good. And like, something like Widows that kind of went under the radar a little bit and is amazing, which I think does, have bridges that gap between like popcorn cinema and stuff that has, some subtext and a meaning behind it and is saying something, where this also tries to do that, but it's probably like his most accessible movie, arguably, with Widows. But I don't know, man, like it just tonally all over the place. You said the pacing kind of, it goes on a bit too long near the end. And there's a whole subplot with Harris Dickinson that like literally doesn't need to be in the movie at all. You can go into that in a second. And yeah, it's a bit all over the place, super messy, and just unfortunately just an absolute misfire on my part from a master filmmaker. So everyone gets one, and maybe he's earned probably 3-4 of these. Like I'm still going to be lined up next thing that he does. But unfortunately, like, this is, you know, I mentioned you drinking the Haterade this year, and I mentioned myself with Anora. Like, Sean Baker and Steve McQueen are two filmmakers that I were hitting every single film for me, basically, like almost 10 out of 10s every single movie. So to have, you know, Anora and this back to back for me is a huge bummer, because two of my most anticipated films of the year and then two of my biggest disappointments. So whereas in with Anora, I kind of have a desire to go and reassess that movie based on my headspace and you know, my expectations and all those kind of
And the
things. Not no,
critical reception has been
yeah,
more positive
yeah,
with Anora, and maybe you feel a little bit like, oh, maybe I just didn't get it because so many other people are. But I think with Blitz, there
yeah,
is more of a
way more mixed. Yeah,
divisiveness when it comes to like, oh, if you really like it, if you really don't. I think what works in this movie, and what also is ultimately disappointing, is the opening scene of the film is so strong, where you have this chaotic sort of
intense as hell.
plunge into a post bombing where firefighters are on the scene and they're trying to put out the flames. But then you also, like, something that you don't think about, but how you know, erratic a scene like that can be, and how you don't have control on certain things, and even just, you know, a hose that loses control, and the nozzle being sort of heavy and made out of metal hitting a firefighter in the face. Like, you feel that in the opening sequence, and when you get that establishing shot, you think, oh, we're going to be given something like Widows, or even with 12 Years a Slave, where it's like, you think it's this, you know, prestigious drama, or the wrapping paper of a prestigious drama, but inside of that is an artist's sort of, you know, interpretation of it, and he's injecting, you know, something that's a little bit maybe either esoteric or challenging to the viewer to understand, you know, where you are in place and time, and seeing, you know, a period piece like this, in which we have seen before, you know, even something like John Borman's Hope and Glory, or, you know, like a lot of the films that kind of dealt with like the Battle of Britain. And so you think to yourself, okay, well, maybe we're going to see this in a different way. And as you were mentioning with, like, you know, I think with the criticism of it all happening in one day to this child, I do agree, like, realistically speaking, it would never happen, in the same way that I think a lot of people criticized Training Day, you know, for all the events that
sure,
happened to Ethan Hawke in Training Day. It's like, well, how could all of this happen in one day? But the I think where he's kind of playing almost in genre with this movie, and I still agree with you, I don't think it works, but I think, like, where, like, that you mentioned, like, the historical fiction of it, I think the fiction part of it, where it's coming into play, is it's almost an adventure fable. Like, it feels a
yeah,
little bit like a fairy tale, even to the point when you have Stephen Graham and his sort of, you know, group of thieves that have been referenced to Charles Dickens specifically. It feels like it becomes Oliver Twist
yeah,
for a little bit, and some of those characters are more exaggerated and cartoony and over the top. Um, but the sound design, I think, is one of the stronger aspects. I do think
agreed.
there are a couple of details that you appreciate from the perspective of, like, I remember my grandfather would always talk to me about what it was like growing up, and also at that period where, you know, rationing was an important thing. And you know, there's a moment where a child eats a sandwich and there's strawberry jam in it, and he references that. Or when you see Saoirse Ronan's character, who works at a munitions factory, go on a night on the town with her friends, and they don't have pantyhose, so what they do is they draw the line that the pantyhose would be on their legs. And so, like, things like that, I think, like, that's the show don't tell part of Steve McQueen.
Sure,
But most of it in this movie is tell. It's telling you how to feel, it's telling you what's going on. Some of the placement of flashbacks, structurally speaking, throw this movie off completely in terms of where we are in time and space,
yeah,
and
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 that
sort of,
goes to the pacing issues we're talking about
yeah,
too.
yeah. And
Yeah,
also, you don't I don't I don't know how you felt, but didn't have really any emotional connection to
No.
George or to Saoirse Ronan's Rita or the grandfather played by the Jams Paul Weller. They just kind of felt like archetypes for the most part. And so
Yep.
when you're watching those characters in harrowing situations, if you have an emotional connection to them, you would feel something. But because like Saoirse Ronan is one of the great actors that we have, there's this feeling of like, okay, well, her character is just literally, I work at a munition factory, I'm a mother of this child, and also, I sing, and like the songs feel shoehorned into the
Oh yeah, there's
production.
3 different large musical numbers, and not like as like a musical, but like just people performing music, but they feel weirdly out of place.
It screams, let's get one of these songs a best song Oscar
Yeah.
nomination in this movie. I didn't like the look of the film. I think the compositions and some of the framing, it works. You have Yorick Lasso, who's worked with everyone from Greta Gerwig to Claire Denis. He's a very underrated cinematographer. It's just that digital sheen,
That
that
kinda
kind of
Apple TV
clean,
look.
yeah, that streaming look that I think really takes away something. And I'll talk more about that when we do get around to Gladiator 2, because I feel like it's the same thing with that movie, where like you need a filmic texture for something like this, and especially when
Especially a
you
period piece, right?
and
Yeah.
when you're showing some archival footage as well, and that does have a grainy sort of real world quality, and it's also making, like, Steve McQueen's talked about this, like, part of the point of what he's trying to do here is that it's not just a war between the Germans and the British, it's a war between the British themselves, and the segregation of different cultures and
Yeah.
races and religions all having to come together and sit with each other when you have protesting to open the tube station so people can seek shelter in a time of uncertainty and bombing and violence. And so with that, you're having people that in any other case would never interact with one another. And so with that, like, you see Indian, British people, you see the Jewish community, you see the Black community all having to talk to each other, and oftentimes there's friction and contention and racism and hatred. And so that internal struggle, not only with, I think, McQueen's material, but he is trying to get it at a point here where it wasn't just simply the good versus the bad, it was versing yourself, or versing your own country, and looking at yourself in an examination of that time period. But again, it just kind of feels as though it's very cookie cutter, and it's
Yeah.
being presented in a manner that it's so obvious to how it's being played out in a heavy-handed way that you'd expect this from someone like a Ron Howard or something like that, and not Steve McQueen. And we talked about like the sentimentality in films. Obviously Spielberg is that kind of guy, but what I've always liked about Spielberg, and when Zemeckis was good, there were elements of him where it's like he could take that cheese, that cornball
Yeah.
quality, and interweave it into that narrative. McQueen's not a sentimentalist. He's a muscular filmmaker, and it's not that
Yeah.
he isn't humane, because you watch something like Hunger, or you watch something like 12 Years a Slave, there still is
Yeah.
humanity coming from this artist, this visual artist, but he's not one to be sentimental, and this movie does feel like it does. It wants that, it wants to be Spielbergian, it wants to be Dickensian, it wants to kind of be both about the people, but then also the bigger picture of what was going on then. And those two things, for him as a director, I think he struggled with through this entire movie.
Yeah, and I think, whether that's kind of the Apple TV effect, or, him doing a streaming movie, or him trying to do something that's, after Widows kind of didn't really, critically did well, but, commercially kind of came and went. I don't know whether this is him kind of going, all right, well, let me try something one different, a little bit more accessible, a little bit, it does feel familiar. Um, yeah, and I think it will work on some people. It's just, unfortunately, I think if you have that history of loving a filmmaker and what they're good at, and then you see something like this and you're like, it feels like a step back a little bit. So I don't have much more to add other than what you just said, because you put it very, very well, and I kind of completely agree with everything that you said. Was weird. We just saw Venom 3 and Joker 2.
Well,
So having Stephen Graham and
Lee
Gill.
Gill, yeah.
Yeah. So not that that's no one's fault. It's just when, oh shit. Water bottle.
And I will say that Lee Gill is actually good in Joker Folie à Deux. He's like the only like bright spot in that movie. And in this, as somebody that's trying to, rally everybody and keep the morale up and sort of kind of be the head of, keeping people safe when they're, they don't have a place to go because their home has been bombed and, or it's just not safe on the streets. And there's, again, like going to the Spielberg thing, they all start singing the sea chant in Jaws that Quint sings. So, they're, again, like it does feel like McQueen, for whatever reason, maybe is what you were mentioning, where he felt like, he wants to try again with something that's commercial or more accessible or widely, like it's not as kind of narrow in its filmmaking in terms of like specifying, because like I look at something like Hunger and as a biopic about somebody that protested the British government in the Thatcher era, it like on paper, like it could have been very conventional, but then when you watch it, you're just like you really have to give into that movie, and it is a challenge, but a challenge in a great way where it makes you rethink how you can make a movie like that. This is basically, it's like, I've seen this movie done, and I've seen this movie done with directors that maybe are a little bit more comfortable in balancing tones and, not having children hit by trains to make you then laugh when you're not supposed to. And you can see it coming from a mile away. And, like the impact of all those scenes don't come together. And as you were mentioning before with Harris Dickinson, that whole kind of like love story, like again, like I get what they're doing, because it's like, okay, well, it's a time of war. Like people really didn't have much time to think about, their own love lives or their own, personal sort of effects. They had to kind of be like, okay, vigilant and in the moment. There's a ballroom sequence in this movie where it's a single take and it's impressive, but even where that's placed in the film is very strange in terms of like with mentioning the flashbacks, because at first I thought that was a flashback, or even the dance scene that feels like something out of Lovers Rock, where we learn about Saoirse Ronan and Rita's partner Marcus in terms of what happened to him. Again, it's all about telling you, it tells you everything about it, instead of just like, McQueen is so good at like hinting at things or telling you things through,
little moments
or objects or gestures, and here
and you putting it together yourself, where it has a deeper kind of understanding and meaning of the movie, instead of what you're saying, spoon feeding you with flashbacks and kind of very on the nose kind of commentary and stuff like that, where he's usually, I always reference that shot in Widows, which is very clear what he's saying, but it's done in such a creative way, of that car shot that kind of does the 360 and the one take and things like that on the
and showing you like, again, the discrepancy between the affluent and the rich, and the working class or lower class.
And there's just, I think he tries to do that through here, but he does it in a more kind of, here you go, like, so I'm, it's a bummer. It's not a horrible movie by any means. It's just, like, I do think from a technical standpoint, the look of it didn't bother me as much. I still think it looked pretty decent, but
it's slick. I will say that it is super slick.
Which the slick stuff doesn't bother me as much, depending on, I agree with you that with movies that maybe our period pieces, I'd like a little film grain. I'd like some texture, or even if it's added in post and things like that. But, that's a personal kind of preference thing too. But yeah, ultimately didn't vibe with it. But I will be, first in line for whatever McQueen does next. So it's not, a little bit of a misfire, but hey, he tried it, and unfortunately it didn't work for us. So it's in theaters now, in select theaters. So it was playing here at the Lightbox in Toronto. I believe it's at some Cineplex theaters as well, because Cineplex Pictures has it here in Canada. And then it's going to be streaming on Apple TV on November 22nd, I believe. So
Yes.
I'd say it is a, it's a loud movie. It's not necessarily an action movie or anything. Like, I could say, if you really are interested in seeing it and haven't yet, because you're just a McQueen, completionist or something, maybe wait till Apple TV. Um, but I don't think you need to kind of necessarily rush out and go see it. And that's kind of all I have to say about it.
I know, and it's such a bummer because I know you joked about this as well when the day we saw it. We saw that in Clint Eastwood's Juror Number
And
Two.
we like Juror number 2 more,
Two
which is
more, I know.
wild.
Which, yeah. Again, Clint Eastwood also very polarizing figure in some ways, but a hit or miss director depending on the material. But with Juror Number Two, I think it was surprising in terms of just how it wasn't overly complicated. It was just really well made, simple meat and potatoes type filmmaking, but it knew what it was. And, Clint Eastwood had the confidence in the material to tell the story in a pretty plain fashion, but still be entertaining, and that's the kind of guy that McQueen is. Like, maybe not entertaining per se, but I do think that there's entertaining elements
No,
of
yeah.
Widows for sure. But he's a guy that knows what he's doing, as a visual artist, as a director. I think maybe his weakness, I guess, here, because he co-wrote, where he wrote this as well, where in the past he has worked with other writers, or he hasn't just simply written his material himself. So maybe there's something there where his own vision of London during World War II, um gets in the way in terms of the writing component of it. And
Yeah.
maybe again, like, he's also talked about, like, growing up in like the 50s and 60s, and post World War II, where you would see, like, the bombing sites still there, and kids would play on them, and things like that, and it was dangerous. And there was another movie that did that a little bit recently as well, called Living, which was the British remake of Ikaru, the Kurosawa movie. So, like, like, on paper, this movie is so exciting. And you have a top filmmaker. We didn't even really talk too much about Saoirse Ronan, and it just feels like
Yeah.
anyone could have played that role, and it just didn't need to be her. And that's also a problem, because you think, like, what like, he's worked with
Because she's
all.
so great too,
Yeah,
but
and
yeah.
he works so well with Irish actors. Like, I mean, obviously with Fassbender in the 3 films that he's made with him, and then Colin Farrell in Widows, and now, like, with Saoirse, it's like you think, like, oh, you've got one of the best actors working. She's going to add something to this role that would be a little bit more. But yeah, you just never feel the emotional heft.
Yeah.
She's
She's fine.
fine,
Yeah.
but, like, it's like, again, you could put someone else in that role, and they would probably be.
Equally as fine.
Yeah, and it's like, well, why is Saoirse Ronan in this movie?
Yeah. I totally agree with you. So a little bit of a bummer, but it is what it is. Thank you all for listening. We really do appreciate it. We have lots of other stuff that you guys can check out right now. We have Eric's done a couple reviews, interviews. He has a second interview with Sean Baker for Honora that you guys can check out. He also has an interview up for Bird, as well as, I think those are the 2 most recent ones, right, Eric?
Yes, and we did some coverage for the Windsor Film Festival with movies like Maria, which will be getting a release at the end of November, which, I think we both liked. We didn't love, but we really
Mhm.
did appreciate Cody Smith McPhee as Mandrix. So
Yeah, that is true. And then you know what? I've just decided right now that I want to talk about Juror number 2. So go check out that review as well, because I
Ooh,
think Eric and
ooh.
I should review that since we saw these two movies in the same day. So,
Yeah.
and then we will have reviews up for Wicked and Gladiator 2 at some point, as well as those discussions about Walt Disney World and Universal Studios, that are kind of little mini travel series that we want to do. Those will be up soon as well. So please go check out all of that. A little bit of, I know we're always like this in flux. We're trying to update our letterbox. We're trying to do kind of get everything set for the new year. And now that I've finished school and graduated and I'm settled in, I'm looking for work, but I'm trying to get everything kind of, and I know we promise this to you guys all the time, and we're trying, though. It's hard with lives and things like that, but we really do appreciate people who still tune in, listen, and always kind of say some kind words to us about the show. So thank you all for sticking around. We'll be back soon. Please go check out all my social medias at Matt Rohrbeck, and Eric's at EM6211. Check out all of his interviews and reviews over on rogerstv.com. Is it still rogerstv.com/cinemascene? You were
It
telling me
is.
that
It is.
okay.
They moved. So we, this is two worlds collide here. They updated the website, so they had to move a bunch of links. They basically migrated everything.
But the main site is
But the main site is still the same. Yes, and now there are reviews that span back to like 2011. So if you want to see those reviews, go for it. But yeah, they're there. And also to mention to Matt, there will be a couple more interviews coming up as well that will be popping in. So, we appreciate like anybody, as Matt said, like just taking, not even if they don't listen to the whole thing, like even if they're like, oh, I'm curious about this for 5 seconds. And
yeah, I mean, we've had a couple weird years, right? But we always still love doing this. So we try to
Yeah.
do it as much as we can. We miss certain movies just based on when you see them, when I see them. But I do want to, try to.
But I
especially
do
as we
think
get
once
into the end of the
we
year.
get into the new year, I think like we're going to be coordinating a little bit better when it comes to, because
Mhm.
Matt just graduated, so like that will be something where like school takes up so much time.
Yeah,
And
the mental breakdown into school took a lot of time. So
it sounds like
it's
a
like,
memoir.
yeah, from MB to yeah, anyways, my mental breakdown to school, the majority of my time was consumed by that stuff. So now that I once I get a job, or depending on what I'm doing, obviously um those things will change. But I think with you doing a lot of interviews, we've been trying to keep up with putting out consistent stuff for you guys to kind of listen to. We just like to do more reviews and more main shows, depending on what we want to talk about, which with the TIFF episode and with the WIF episode, film festivals, obviously we love them, and I think we're very good at covering them. So that was a good
And they give us
kind of thing.
time, right? Like,
Yeah.
because like a lot of the stuff that we covered for TIFF and WIF are still opening now.
Totally.
So, if you're curious about anything that's opening, that's played the festival circuit,
We
go back to
probably
those
covered it
episodes.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you all again. And we'll be back soon. Until next time.
Sweet November rain. That's all I got.
Bye.